So if I start screaming through the mic, please tell me to tone it down. First of all, let me begin by thanking all of you for being here and for this invitation. It's really exciting at some level to be presenting my work in an Asian context, given my Texas space that I needed to mark with the infamous tower of death, I should add. That's another long story. But it's really wonderful to be here and share these stories, thinking about Asian fertilities at some level. I'm coming out of doing a long research project on celibacy in India, and at some level I've given up on doing this kind of work because it's very dystopic, as some of you who are already doing this work would imagine, as you start doing this. So I've started a new project this semester, starting in January, on migrant workers and migrant work and what I call aspirational fertility. This is actually taking me back to a much older interest that I had on software migrant workers from India, specifically Bangalore, into the US, and also the migration of work from the US into places like Bangalore, which have been considered the BPOs, the business process outsourcing centers, right? So which has been very central to Bangalore's growth, which when I left Bangalore in 1989, it was a city of, I don't know, barely 1 million people. Today it's easily over 8 million people. So at some level that is very central to the story, I want to say. Okay. So what do I want to do with this project? By the way, I would love feedback because it's at some level a new project. I'm in the middle of fieldwork. I've only done 8 interviews, which is, if people know the size of India, 8 is nothing. I mean, 8 is nothing. I've interviewed 70 with mothers. So 8 IT workers is nothing. I presume that I will be able to interview a lot more people by this time. It's amazing how people don't want to talk about not having sex. Ultimately, that is what the story is about. It's not about people having sex and having infertility, but it's about the inability to have sex. So I really thought I would be having a lot more interviews. It's amazing how people don't want to talk about it. So what do I want to use? Some of the terms I want to use and I've used in this article so far, in this working paper, is I use the term unintentional fertility, right? This is a term that has been used very commonly in the US because 40% of childbirths in in the US are because of unintentional fertility. So there's a whole bunch of studies of unintentional fertility and the health effects on children. What I'm really interested in studying is unintentional infertility. We all know that infertility can be intentional. There's many people who use contraception and other forms of safe sex to avoid pregnancies. So we certainly know a whole bunch about intentional infertility. What do I mean by unintentional, what should have been written as unintentional infertility, is that here are couples or individuals who begin their reproductive trajectories thinking that they're going to delay their fertility, and then they realize further down that they're simply unable to get pregnant. Not simply because there's certain kinds of health-related issues, there's certainly some of that, but there's simply no time with certain of the people I'm interviewing to have sex. So then there's a situation that starts developing which I call unintentional infertility. It's never intended. Infertility is never intended, of course, but in this case it becomes compounded by the fact that they hadn't been infertile before, but there's certain kinds of processes that don't have to do with decision-making alone, but with the precarious economic environment within these people are workers. The second term that I want to think through is the choreography between workplace demands and fertility aspirations. Now, those of you who've done this kind of work are probably familiar with Harris Thompson's ontological choreography, where she's thinking about the different kinds of actors, legal, medical, right? Egg providers, sperm providers, mortgage providers, right? All of these different actors who come together to making assisted reproductive technologies available. Instead, I want to think through the notion of choreography to think about how bodies need to be organized across time and space in order to make fertility possible for these couples. Now, there are two groups of people that I really want to study. One group are Indian information technology workers, and these would be IT workers, software, associated with different IT-related work. And what I'm thinking about in this case is I would like to focus specifically on the city of Bangalore, which is where I grew up, which has been considered the Silicon Valley of India, which is not a complimentary thing to say about Bangalore at all, but it's used in a derogatory way. I want to study these individuals because this is a case where work is migrating into India, right? So it's the movement of outsourced work into India, where these workers are involved in stuff that needs to be done perhaps in the US, so on and so forth, and there are all of these outsourced projects that we're working on. And the second group of people that I'm really interested in is migrant workers, not migrating work, but migrating workers who go to the various cities of the Middle East to build these cities. If you think about cities like Abu Dhabi, Doha, Dubai, a large number of construction workers, the majority of construction workers in these spaces are Indian Muslim men, many from the southern Indian state of Kerala who go in to do construction work. So these are the two populations that I'm really interested in thinking through what migrating work and migrating workers has in terms of fertility decision making. At some level, it's been really hard as well, as I've already explained, to do these kinds of research. I will be potentially going to Kerala to do my work with Muslim migrant workers. But I've begun doing interviews with Indian software IT workers. I start off my paper really discussing the first case. I keep forgetting their names because I've made up pseudonyms. There's the M couple, there's the C couple, and there's the T couple. Sorry, I'm just kind of making up names as I go along with these, and I'm trying to use the same letters so it's easy to code and also have some sort of anonymity. I start off my paper by looking at the case of Madan, who lives in Austin, Texas. He's originally from my home city, Bangalore, and now we both live in Austin, I guess. And we're having this conversation about his reproductive trajectory. He says he's 27 when he gets married to his wife who's 28, and they're both software workers in Bangalore. They actually are married in 2001. They get pregnant very shortly the year after, and they decide, look, this is too early, we've just gotten married. I don't know whether we're really ready to be having a baby, and they opt for an abortion, right? And so they have an abortion, and they're quite happy with their decision. And further down, 4 years later, they decide maybe they have an accidental pregnancy. Their intentional infertility doesn't work, and they end up getting pregnant. Unfortunately, at this point in time, they feel they might be ready to have this baby, but it turns out to be a tubal ligation. Tubal pregnancy. Sorry, I'm so used to talking about tubal ligations in my older work. It's a tubal pregnancy, and she miscarries her fetus, and the entire tube is destroyed. The right fallopian tube is destroyed. And that leaves them quite devastated. At this point in time, they think they're going to be using IVF to get pregnant. But what happens at this point in time is Madan gets transferred to the US to begin a new job. It's an intra-company transfer, meaning he's working for company X, which shall remain unnamed right now. And the company has branches. It's a US company that has branches in India as well as Bangalore. And within the company's firm, he gets an L1 visa to do an intra-company transfer. He receives this intra-company transfer. He's in the US. He's separated from his wife for a few months. And then his wife, who I call Madhu, also receives an L1 and joins him because they're working for the same company. They're living in Austin, Texas, and the pressures that they're starting to feel with work start increasing. Why is it that the pressures that start increasing? They're realizing they want to convert their L1 visas into H1B visas, which are temporary work permits. And in order to do that, they need to put in more effort, and there's more eagerness in doing the kind of work to prove themselves to be worthy workers, right? And then what happens is once they get to their H1Bs, they realize they want permanent residency. They do not want to be temporary workers with very limited rights who will have to leave the US in 6 years if the company doesn't sponsor them. So they further self-exploit, if you will, working harder. Finally, by the end of all of this, they realize they are, that a mother is 40 years old, and the child that they always wanted to have still hasn't materialized, and they try an IVF again. Right? She does get pregnant, and she finally has a child at 41 years of age. And I'm talking with Madan saying, and he says, the only advice I would have for young people today is as soon as you get pregnant, just have that baby. Right? My wife and I made a horrible decision. If I was to redo it, this is what we would do. And he also says, now that I have a baby and now that I have job security, I don't give everything I have to my job. I keep the best for myself. Right? He's finally in the position to say that I don't need to be a slave to my labor market. I can actually exit out of it in ways that I feel I can do so. Right? What is interesting then for me is the ways by which the workplace actually has an impact on the fertility decision making. Very often when you think about fertility rates, women tend to get blamed very heavily. These are career-oriented women. These are people who delay fertility because they would rather focus on their careers, so on and so forth. They've aged out, and look at them going and using surrogate mothers in India, you know, selfish women, so on and so forth. But what I find that's interesting that's happening here is men also are a large part of the fertility decision making that women tend to do. It has to do with access to sperm, right? Which then, if you're talking about access to sperm, it's access to having sex with your husbands, because we're talking about heterosexual couples here. And very often what I'm finding with my research is there's very little sex happening among couples in high-wage jobs. That is what I'm starting to find, right? There are two other cases that I would like to present in Gurgaon, near Delhi. This is certainly not a site I'm going to do an ethnography of, because this is as alien to me as, I don't know, any other place that could be in the face of this earth. I'm not a Hindi speaker. Gurgaon is absolutely frightening for me. I'm a South Indian. The two cases, these are basically Skype and telephone interviews that I did with people I call Tarun and Tanuja and Chitra and Chetan. Those are the names that I use. Let me speak a bit about the first couple. They have an arranged marriage. Tanuja actually lives and grows up in Calcutta. Her parents arranged a marriage for her with Tarun. And she says to me the very first week of marriage that she then moves to Delhi, which is really near Gurgaon, right? She says she is actually, the first week of marriage seems to be all right because her husband is coming back home quite early. And that's because his manager is in the US for some conference. But she says from the second week of marriage, the boss returns, and her husband tends to stay at work from around 9:30 in the morning to around 9:30, 10 at night, right? And she says being a newly married couple and never having engaged in sex before, these days that she says were really complicated and messy and difficult for her. Right? There is a partner that she needs to be intimate with, but at the same time there is no intimacy in terms of getting to know each other. That's how hard these days were. She also tells me that she spends so much time at home and she's bored doing nothing in Delhi. She doesn't have her friends, she doesn't have her parents, they're all in Calcutta, so she decides she's going to get a job. Because there's nothing else to do other than waiting for her husband in this new space, and she's totally isolated. She gets this job and she absolutely loves the kind of work that she's doing. right? And she starts getting very successful in her work. Eventually, she's traveling as well, as her husband is traveling as well, but she keeps traveling quite often to Singapore, where she's managing a whole series of projects for British Telecom. And she becomes very important in that whole set of projects that her company is doing for British Telecom. And she starts growing in the company. She becomes a team leader. She's leading a team of 30 to 40 people. And she absolutely loves her job. She thinks like this is the best thing that she could be doing. And she feels very affirmed, right? But then what she's also starting to realize is the doctor diagnoses her with polycystic ovarian syndrome. Now, polycystic ovarian syndrome, for people who don't know, is basically a hormonal situation in the body. No one quite knows why or how it's caused. There is no medical reason for why this occurs. There's certainly indications that it could be genetically related, that, you know, mothers with PCOS tend to have daughters with PCOS. I mean, in India, you just call it PCOS because it's such a common syndrome. Very often, diabetes is associated, type 2 diabetes is associated with PCOS. And I don't know whether, it's just correlated. We don't know whether there's necessarily a causal relationship between the two, right? But very often you could say PCOS is also caused by inactivity, bad diet, stress, all of which Tanuja is certainly undergoing, and this is actually making her PCOS condition worse. She claims at some level how much weight she puts on when she's doing this kind of work, and how there's simply no time for exercise, right? And so they decide then at that point in time, you know what, she has this, oh, and also with polycystic ovarian syndrome, your periods are very irregular, and there's also a compromised fertility, though you couldn't say it's completely difficult and impossible, right? It compromises your fertility. So that's when then Tanuja decides she wants to do IVF, right? She then decides what she's going to do. She's going to do IVF. I'm forgetting now whether it's with Tanuja or with the other case. What is interesting for me in all of these stories is the descriptions where these people are saying how little sex happens between the couple, right? And I'll discuss that without going into details on this particular couple. But what happens is Tanuja decides she's going to do an IVF. And, she does 3 IUIs, intrauterine inseminations, all of which lead to miscarriages. What happens then is, it's really interesting for me in terms of how she speaks about the loss of these pregnancies. She is, of course, deeply devastated by pregnancy loss. But interestingly, she doesn't talk about her husband's devastation in terms of the pregnancy loss. She talks about how devastated her mother, but especially her father, is that the daughter is unable to sustain a pregnancy, right? Her parents. Not her in-laws, not her husband, but it really becomes about this pregnancy loss for her and for her parents, right? Which I thought was really interesting. Now, the third case that I have in the paper, Chitra and Chetan. What is interesting in this story for me, without going into the whole details, is Chetan eventually gets transferred to London. He's in London right now. And actually, yes, he is right now in London. 9 months into it, I guess he has 3 more months. I just did this interview. And Chitra is right now in Gurgaon. And she was able to get a transfer in her company to go work in London, to be with her husband, so they could stay in the same place. And then she says this is actually a promotion for her, and she wanted to get pregnant because she was there with her husband. Instead, what ends up happening is, well, she tells me 4 months of the 9 months they've been apart, they overlap, and she tells me, oh, we tried having a baby 3 or 4 times, right? It didn't happen, and plus the last time we had unprotected sex, over 3 or 4 times, I developed a UTI, a urinary tract infection. And just the idea of unprotected sex did not feel great. So we decided we would do an IVF. Right? But also what is interesting as well is even though this job that she has in London is a promotion, her mother and sister convince her to come back to Gurgaon so she can get pregnant in Gurgaon where the mother and sister can support her pregnancy. So with this couple, the first IVF failed. They're now gearing up for a subsequent IVF pregnancy, I guess now in May or maybe June. I need to figure that out, right? So what I'm starting to realize with a lot of these stories is that time becomes an incredibly scarce resource for the couples, right? Why is time a scarce resource here? It's nothing to do with what the individuals are doing so much as the labor market for high wage work, right? And not just the husbands, not just the wives, but the husbands as well. What happens is, given the cultures of work in India, men and women tend to put in long hours of work in a place like Bangalore. Work tends to start around 10 o'clock in the day, because people tend to work later in the day, but they end up staying at work until 8:39 in the evening. Very often, some of the people that I spoke with said they worked until 11 at night, right? The expectation is that they put in these long hours in the workplace, right? Why are they putting in these long hours of work? One of the reasons is not just the work culture and the expectations of their boss, Tarun's boss, who wants them to be there in these long hours, but very often the work in India is coordinated to work cycles in the US, Singapore, and other parts of the world, which are on different time zones. So in order to accommodate work that's been done in a different country that's going to be then sent to India to complete another cycle to be sent back, or to coordinate between colleagues across time zones, then means these Indian workers are putting incredibly long hours of work. They're on call very often. The other thing that's happening as well is they're on their telephones all the time, right? They're on call all the time. Some of these workers actually say this is fantastic because they're able to get a lot more done, but there simply seems to be no downtime. On Sundays you could be on call, on vacation, guess what? There's a work call you need to do. The number of times I've had lunches with friends and they need to run out because there's a work call. It's incredible that they're on call all the time. Right? So the hours they're putting in, precisely because they can log from outside of the workplace, makes the workday much longer. Right? The other thing that's going on is there are long commutes in cities like Bangalore and Gurgaon. To travel maybe 7 to 8 kilometers in a city like Bangalore can take anywhere from 45 minutes to I don't know, 75 minutes. And there's really no sidewalks that you can walk on. It's snarling traffic, and driving in such traffic is absolutely miserable. Most Indian, upper middle class Indians hire chauffeurs, people we call drivers, who can simply negotiate the kind of traffic that we need to drive in, while these workers then to take calls and get more work done while they're commuting. Right? Very often the people that I spoke with were using Uber, so they didn't have to drive themselves and deal with the crazy traffic. So that as well becomes very stressful. One of the persons that I interviewed actually says they spend 3 hours every day commuting back and forth from work, not because of the distances, but because of traffic and the stress that that can cause. Right? The next thing then is the extra effort and time they put into work. What many of these workers feel incredibly anxious about is that they could get downsized on a job. There simply is no job security. So in order to then prove to their employers what good workers they are, they self-exploit like crazy. Right? This is exactly what happens in Madan's case, where he says, I need to show that I can do more than 100% of my work, right? And so then they're also doing an incredible amount of work for much more than is at some level required, simply so they have some level of job security, right? So these then means they're putting in a lot of work over the course of a single day. But add to that then the amount of travel that they do within India itself, but also the frequent trips that they do outside, in and out of India. Chitra, for example, the case that I didn't discuss, she says what she does is she has at least 5 to 7 days per month that she's out of Gurgaon doing work. And it's very often she does at least 2 to 3 times a year. She spends half a month out of Gurgaon in off-site places doing work. So what you start seeing happening for these couples is that time becomes an incredibly scarce resource. They hardly have time with each other, right? Just like I don't have enough time to finish my presentation. They have very little time with each other, which means there's no social intimacy. They're starting to become strangers to each other. Part of it might be because of the arranged marriages that you have, but also part of it is, but you don't see this just in arranged marriages, but you also see this in marriages where couples choose to marry each other. There's just no time. And once you don't have time with each other, they just don't feel like having sex with each other, because it seems to be such an alienated and anaerobic thing to engage in this incredibly mechanical exercise, it seems like, to have sex with each other. So what then ends up happening is many of these individuals start using IVF to attain pregnancy. I'll end it at that. I'm happy to do Q&A later on. Thank you very much.